Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, Crossing Boundaries for Social Justice Conference. It's nice to see many of you again as we approach the last day of the conference. I think it's been a great conference for most of us, if not everyone. Really interesting discussions throughout the time, and we just really appreciate your participation in this really important event. A few housekeeping items before we get to today's events. As many of you have already seen in the lobby, there's going to be refreshments and some small things to eat throughout the time here today. Mind you, we end at 2 o'clock today. We'll end the conference for that time. We also have an abbreviated lunch later this, it actually starts at 11:45 a.m. again in the main lobby, where breakfast was served. It's going to be abbreviated lunch. It's not necessarily meant for you to sit down for a long period of time, but just something to kind of grab and take with you as you either leave the conference or finish the last remaining sessions, just in case you need to catch your flight or whatever the case may be. And then after our plenary session coming up in a few moments, we're going to have a short break beginning at 10:15 a.m. Before we get into the final concurrent sessions, sessions 10 and 11, that begin at 10:30 and end at 11:45 a.m. So anticipate us having a hard out in terms of the time, just because we want to make sure we get to some really key important announcements at the end of the conference that we are really excited about telling you all as well. That looks like for the most part, those are the main housekeeping items. Oh, one more thing. So the concurrent session room has changed. We talked about this for the past 2 days, but in case you didn't catch it. So the concurrent sessions happening in room 004 in the program are actually going to happen in room 003. So just right across the hall. It won't take much effort to find that next room. And again, if you have any other questions or any other comments or concerns, feel free to reach out to myself. I'll be in the lobby, Sandra or Casey, wherever you may see us around. So just be mindful of that. That really is the main things for the housekeeping items, and we will go ahead and start our plenary session. I don't know where the speakers are. Oh, you're right there. Yeah, if you guys want to join us on stage whenever you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Good morning. So excited to introduce these three amazing speakers and to hear what they have to say. Joining us, we have Ankit Bhardwaj, a doctoral candidate at New York University, Heba Gowayed, an associate professor of sociology at CUNY Hunter College and Graduate Center, and Irvin, an associate professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So excited for each of you to talk for roughly about 10 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. And so I'll let you guys get started and fully introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for, firstly, thank you so much for the invitation. It's such an honor to be invited to speak at such a wonderful event. And also thank you for the organizers, Professor Sandra Barnes, Julian, for organizing everything in the background. It's been really wonderful. So today I want to do, the theme of the panel was extending Du Bois, and I want to offer two extensions today. One, Du Bois, to make the case that Du Bois was an environmentalist, that his theories have insights for our current ecological crises and the ones of his time, and that we can also interpret his environmentalism as an extension of his training under the pragmatist tradition under William James and John Dewey. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 was the most destructive river flood in the history of the United States, with 27,000 square miles, and if you prefer metric, 70,000 square kilometers, inundated in depths of up to 30 feet or 9 meters of water over the course of several months. About 500 people died, but more than 750,000 people were directly affected, many of whom were black plantation workers in the lower Mississippi River and had to live for lengthy periods of time in relief camps. Plantation owners feared runaways. The Great Flood's disaster relief effort was a shambles, as plantation owners, the National Guard, the Red Cross, chose to confine the black plantation workers in the floodplains rather than move them to relief camps in safer zones. At the time, Du Bois was the editor of The Crisis. Du Bois commissioned ethnographers to visit the floodplains and ran a series of editorials in 1927 and 1928 on the Great Flood, which detailed in deep descriptive ethnographic account the experience of the stranded plantation workers and argued about the horrifying post-disaster conditions that were not just a natural event, but a continuation of the slave-based political economy. And he ran this image in an edition in 1928, and just to describe it a little, it is a barge that's sitting in a plantation floodplain. There are tents on this barge, and it's extremely crowded. People are shoulder to shoulder in this quote-unquote relief camp. You can imagine both the disease, the lack of food, the destitute situation that these plantation workers would have found themselves in this relief camp. And arguing, and in this kind of really tremendous editorial that he wrote, he argued for the workers to escape from the slave camps guarded by and I'm quoting here, quote, "escape from the slave camps guarded by the National Guard and the National Red Cross for the benefit of the big planters of Mississippi and Louisiana and the lynchers of Arkansas will leave this land of devilry at first opportunity." I was struck by this wonderful but also horrifying account that Du Bois had about an environmental disaster. It harkened back to debates that were happening in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and it made me think that Du Bois was not just a scholar of race and racism, but one that took extremely seriously questions of environmental harm. And in doing so, I wrote this paper called The Soils of Black Folk, which explores Du Bois's theories of environmental theories in light of environmental debates. But in this talk today, I want to not only convince you that Du Bois is a theorist of the environment, but to locate his environmentalism in the wider tradition of pragmatism. So Du Bois obviously took a class with William James when he was at Harvard, but he also was in frequent correspondence with John Dewey. John Dewey was part of the General Committee of the NAACP. But also, not only to just, locate Du Bois as a pragmatist, but to also trace a common connection that he had with another great social thinker of the time, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, as many of you might know, was the leader of the untouchability or Dalit movement in India and one of the crafters of the Indian Constitution. And he trained under John Dewey at Columbia University. And I want to argue today that both these thinkers found ways to radicalize the insights of pragmatism to questions of the environment. But before we get there, I want to break down a little bit about the argument that's in my paper. So scholarship on Du Bois has neglected his engagement with environmental themes. But I find that in my readings of all his texts, including of his archive, not only was he concerned with ecology, such as the health of soils and water, but environmental themes also figured in his explanations of racism. Du Bois's writings exhibit what we would today recognize as engagement with environmental themes such as the ecological and natural non-human. He centered his analysis in Black Reconstruction on the struggles over land. He detailed colonial capitalism's extraction of natural resources such as fertile soils, cocoa, coal, cotton, rubber, ivory. He demonstrated how the stigmatizing association of workers with degraded soils racialized them. He wrote poetically of the exploitation of animals and pollution of his hometown river. He ran editorials in the aftermath of the Great Mississippi Flood. He detailed and challenged the segregation of newly designated national parks, and he helped chart manifestos calling for the equitable distribution of natural resources by states. Du Bois offers an account that advances the existing focus of environmental justice in contemporary environmental thought. So currently, the way scholars of racism and the environment tend to think of the mechanism is that there are racist social structures that segregate who has access to environmental harms and benefits, which then leads to unequal environmental distributions. Du Bois's unique insight was that it's also, it's sort of kind of like a circular loop, but in a reverse mechanism, that the unequal environmental distribution of both harms and benefits can reinforce racism, and it can calcify racial categories. I termed this process environmental racialization, how exclusive access to environmental goods like land or stigmatizing association with environmental harms like degraded soils shapes the adoption of racism and racial classification. So an example that Du Bois took up, and you know what's really fascinating about Du Bois's environmental thought is that it pervades his work right from the beginning. His dissertation on Harvard engaged with questions of degraded soils, but so did texts in the souls of black folk. So, you know, in this famous paragraph that I'm sure many of us have memorized by heart, he criticizes car window sociologists who blame black workers for being quote unquote shiftless. But curiously, his argument focuses on the relationship between black plantation workers and the soil. He argues, and yet those boys, follow in like an ethnographic sense, they're not lazy. Their great defect as laborers lie in their lack of incentive. It's a great kind of sociological insight. They're careless because they have not found that it pays to be careful. Above all, they cannot see why they should take unusual pains to make the white man's land better. So here he offers an ecological argument, that they're in this current political economy where workers do not own the land, they have no incentives to take care of it. That the degradation of the soils of plantations eventually was blamed on workers rather than on the plantation owners themselves who benefited from this political economy arrangement. He advances this argument in the question in Black Reconstruction. He argues if the basic problem of Reconstruction in the South was economic, then the kernel of the economic situation was the land. And central to his argument in Black Reconstruction is the fact that expansion to the West afforded opportunities for white workers to settle the land and not black workers. But he also offers an ecological mechanism here. He argues that because plantations degraded soils, plantation owners had more incentives to accumulate more land. And he had this insight as early on as his dissertation at Harvard. He argues, it was, for example, found cheaper to work a slave to death in a few years than to buy a new one, than to care for him in sickness and old age. So too, it was easier to despoil rich new land in a few years of intensive culture and move on to the Southwest than to fertilize and conserve the soil. Consequently, there early came a demand for land and slaves greater than the country could supply. The demand for land showed itself in the annexation of Texas, the conquest of Mexico, and the movement towards acquisition of Cuba. So here he ties in the ecological imperative of the plantation economy with the expansionic ethic of the colonial South. And he also points out that conflict over land reinforced divisions between black and white workers. He argues in his chapter in Black Reconstruction that white workers began to see a way out in America through quote unquote free land of the West. Here was a solution such as was impossible in Europe. Plenty of land, rich land, land coming daily nearer its own markets. This thought, curiously enough, instead of increasing the sympathy for the slave, turned it directly into rivalry and enmity. So the expansion to the West could have offered an opportunity of solidarity between black and white workers. And it wasn't just contestation over jobs that divided their interests, but also, as Du Bois argues, land. So that's sort of a small piece of the argument that I offer in the text. And I just want to quickly kind of show that both these insights that Du Bois has about how environments shape our experience and how categories of that we have shape our experience in environments comes to be influenced by his reading of John Dewey and William James. So these were two tenets of pragmatism. As Dewey argued, the career and destiny of a living being are bound up with its interchanges in the environment. And also that our theories are ways in which we can modify environments, right? So as James argues, theories are instruments. On occasion can make nature over again by their aid. And we see Du Bois arguing that it's not just that they, in general, that they shape environments or that environments shape our experience, but that these are racialized. And that's kind of fundamental to what Du Bois is up to here. He modifies and improves upon the pragmatist theory to make sense of inequality of experience of people within environments. So, for example, he wrote about not only, the Jim Crow waiting room, but also the kind of environmental pressures that a body can feel in such a segregated environment, the heat of the winter, there's no heat in the winter and there's no air in the summer. But he also took up this idea to think about how our categories modify our environment. So he, later on in his work, he offers a kind of physical counterpart to double consciousness, what he calls the double environment, where he talks about the segregated social world, one in which the white surrounding world and another furnished by his own colored group. Right. So just to wrap up here, I want to offer that Ambedkar too had very similar insights when it came to the environment and caste. He argued that our categories of caste can shape who gets access to environmental goods, such as water. In a famous essay that he wrote, he's reflecting on a childhood experience where he's traveling from his village to the city. And in this process, he encounters, he's thirsty and he's encountering a toll collector's hut who he goes up to and asks for water. The toll collector asks him, quote, "Who are you?" he inquired. And in this case, Ambedkar was advised to hide the fact that he was from the lower caste, because in that sense, he would have polluted the Hindu toll collector's water. He instead pretends that he is Muslim. Ambedkar replies, quote, "I replied that we were Muslimans. I conversed with him in Urdu, which I knew very well, so as to leave no doubt that I was a real Musliman. But the trick did not work, and his reply was very curt. Who has kept water for you?" So here, Ambedkar recognizes that environmental harm and categories come to shape who gets access to clean water. And in this, he actually led political action. So for example, Ambedkar organized a march of Dalits to go to a water tank that was exclusively for upper caste Indians. And he argued, and he gave a speech at the water tank, he says that we now want to go to the tank not only to prove that, like others, we are also human beings. So he offered a universalist ethic in response to the segregation of environmental goods that he saw as a basis of caste. Du Bois, too, in his many manifestos, argued similarly. He argued that we should call for the intervention of the state to provide water for power, cheap electricity for homes all over the land. We could have a transformation of life and consequent raising of wages and standards of living if we wanted it. But we do nothing about this because we want to make certain persons who can monopolize and see land and power rich beyond the dreams of avarice. And in another manifesto, he calls for the public ownership of control of water, electric, and atomic power. Curiously, Ambedkar, unlike Du Bois, wasn't a political exile. He was fundamentally part of the creation of the Indian nation state and actually had opportunity to work on some of these actions to make nature in the mold of his image of a universal access to environmental goods. So here is text that he's arguing for in the Indian Constitution, where he calls for the inclusion of free access to rivers, streams, wells, tanks, roads. And he also founded the Damodar River Valley Project, which was inspired by the Tennessee Valley Authority to work through ways in which one could bring water and overcome cost distinctions by equalizing access to environmental goods. So I want to leave you with the fact that Du Bois is an environmental scholar. He thought very deeply about the ecology of soils. He thought deeply about how access to water and other kinds of environmental resources gets determined by racial systems, but also how the unequal distributions come to shape racial categories. So Du Boisian sociology is thus an environmental sociology. With his environmental theories in mind, Du Bois's famous claim that the 20th century's problem is the color line across the world takes on novel and prescient meanings in the 21st, both in the endurance of the color line and our changing environmental world. Thank you.
No, I'm okay. You're good? Yeah, okay, sure. Hi, everybody. Just gonna set up here. Okay. Similarly, I think this works really well together. I'm going to be talking about Du Bois's work in Black cooperatives, economic cooperatives, and mutual aid. And I just want to start by charting my journey to this place. I grew up, particularly also my journey to Du Bois, because I think they're really related. So I grew up in a little orchard town by the name of Harvard, Massachusetts. It's about 2 hours from Great Barrington, where Du Bois was born. And the towns look a lot alike. Both had a handful of Black families that somehow found their way to flourish among people who thought of us as an oddity. But it wasn't until my freshman year at Morehouse College that I learned about this man. He became a kind of father figure for my thinking and for my understanding of how I got here, but most of all, how to get beyond it, or at least outside it, a hometown and a country such as this. What I'm saying is that Du Bois, for me, became a model of persistence, how to keep going, how to keep flourishing, and how to understand how we do that. I'm a scholar of African American literature and culture, and I focus on the ways art helps us rethink Black social life, especially Black social movements. And at the bottom of this inquiry is the question of persistence. I discovered toward the end of grad school that Du Bois and a swarm of other writers, including poets, novelists, journalists, visual artists, intellectuals, and activists of all sorts, turned to something that they were calling the Black cooperative movement. They were calling this a movement over and over again as their way out, as, quote, our way out. On the dusty floor of Columbia's main library, I was reading through big, red, leather-bound volumes of Black newspapers and magazines from the 1920s and 30s. And I saw in large font people praising this movement as our way out. Ironically enough, they considered it promising precisely because, unlike socialism and communism, cooperatives were a way out as a way in. Cooperatives are businesses owned by their makers. They're mutual aid societies in which people pool their resources to meet their most pressing needs. As there is today, there were, of course, many brands of cooperatives from left to right-leaning. Du Bois's idea of cooperatives and the cooperatives he helped to establish were, of course, on the left. In 1920, Du Bois called it the cooperative movement, quote, the most promising of my projected movements. In a letter to his fellow sociologist and friend, Ira Latimer, in the 1930s, he said, of course I think the cooperative movement is the way out. Of course, he said, as if it went without saying. So over the next couple years, my question was how? A way out how? And why this? Why not a communist state or a socialist one? Something I would have expected given everything I had learned about Du Bois. Against the promises of revolution, cooperative enterprises seem to pale in comparison. In fact, a lot of scholars have dismissed his work on cooperatives as secondary to more seemingly radical ventures. We've either confined it to an experimental period of the 1930s, when during the Great Depression, Du Bois was desperate for answers, or we've dismissed it entirely as reformist and provincial. Certainly, now it is faring better in the literature, but I think the reasons for our dismissals, or our initial dismissals, are instructive. It's precisely those reasons that make his activism in writing about cooperative life, Black mutual aid at large, so significant for us. It forces us to change the basic assumptions we have about Du Bois, about his leadership philosophy, and as I argue in my book, the basic assumptions we have about radical social movements, particularly as they're defined around the category of persistence. But before I delve into that, let me get to the punch. before I tell you a little brief story about brief history of his cooperative work, let me just get to the punch of my point. The short of my answer on the how and the why this, on what mode of cooperative, what made the cooperative movement for Du Bois uniquely poised to grow and sustain our flourishing, have to do with time. They have everything to do with time. We tend to think of the success of a social movement along the line of longevity. How long did it last? How long did the changes it made hold up, etc.? In fact, a social movement itself isn't even considered a social movement unless it is sustained for a certain amount of time. Some sociologists define that as 2 to 3 years at the very least before it is simply considered a revolt. But whether it's 5 years or a few months, it doesn't matter. It's measured in terms of linear sustainment. It is a collective resistance sustained in time. Similarly, we tend to think of persistence as a sustainment along one axis of time, moving from here to tomorrow. The remarkable thing about Du Bois's philosophy and practice of establishing cooperatives was that he rethought what it means to persist and to make a movement. He thought of cooperatives as inhabiting a different order of time entirely, something you could describe as what I call a continual beginning. Not returning to the beginning to start again, rather a living in the again, one more time and again, a sustained incipience, if you will. Just, mouth is a little dry. So let me give a brief history. The big moment in his life in cooperative activism was 1918. In 1918, he launched what he called the Negro Cooperative Guild. He called it a guild because he did this at his office in Harlem. He called it a guild because since medieval times, guilds were groups of producers or merchants that agreed to a limit on profit, as well as on the satisfaction of consumerist desires. And this was really important to him. His guild was comprised of 6 state secretaries, a handful of other folks that the names of which have evaded the archive. Their aim was to promote and establish cooperatives that would create jobs. This is a quote here. Basically, these words are quotes here. Jobs, schools, factories that would cooperatives that would steward land, collective land, provide medicine and hospitals, and even put on pageants and parades for the importance of joy and Black social gathering in general. Yet long before 1918, Du Bois was passionate about Black mutual aid. In 1898, he organized the first national conference on Black economic cooperation in Atlanta. In 1905, he wrote a novel imagining the creation of a cooperative society in the South called Quest of the Silver Fleece. This was later published in 1911. And I think it's important to note here that this was all in the wake of the demise, or what the Black press called the massacre, of the largest Black cooperative organization in Black American history, the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union, that had 1 million members across every southern state. And in 1889, it was attacked for basically just its threat to the capitalist economy in Mississippi specifically, and it was known, this attack was known as the Floor Massacre. Its leaders were shot. They came in with guns, they shot their kids. It was massacred. This alliance organization was so big that they had their own print press. And on top of that, later in Tennessee, where Du Bois's first cooperatives would be found, where he would establish his first cooperatives, he called this an area in which it was least likely to emerge because famously, the People's Grocery Store, a cooperative in Tennessee, the owners of the People's Grocery Store one was lynched, and this lynching launched the journalist career of Ida B. Wells. And so there's this long history of cooperative life that shaped African American letters. And I think, in general, when we think of Du Bois's cooperatives following these assaults and this grief, we often have to think about him thinking constantly about what does it mean to persist? How do we keep going in the wake of this history? Okay. So the Cooperative Guild started in 1918. By every record of the archive, it either ended in 1935 or sometime in the it either ended in 1930 or sometime around 1920. There are two dates that emerge. Sometime in the 1920s, because we don't see we don't see this activity, we don't see the organization coming back after 1920, but a historian at the time, a contemporaneous historian, said it ended in 1930. But his promotion, Du Bois's promotion of cooperatives, kept going and kept bringing people together into the 1940s. So what about this question of continual beginning? His interlocutors and fellow activists had an issue with his approach to the movement. They kept on urging him to go forward. They saw him hesitating to establish more co-ops after the first 5 in Tennessee. William C. Matney, a teacher at Bluefield Institute, which is Bluefield State College and HBCU now, he created a cooperative store there that became nationally famous for its success. Matney was a protege of Du Bois, and Du Bois, in turn, thought of Matney as the next leader of the cooperative movement in the 1930s. He wrote, for example, to the president of the Cooperative League of America, the biggest organization on cooperatives in the country, that, quote, I want very much to start with Matney as a nucleus, a movement for cooperation among American Negroes. How am I doing with time? Because I saw you look at your watch. Okay, perfect, okay. I want to start a nucleus movement for cooperation among American Negroes. He wrote that in 1929, and he underlined the letter. He underlined in the letter the word nucleus. So I cannot unpack in my time here why we might see Du Bois's activism as not a hamleting or a failure to move forward, but as an insistence that the movement think of itself in philosophy and practice as a kind of perpetual beginning, but or in the frame of sustained, or if we think about it in the frame of sustainment, in the frame of sustained incipience. But I can, in the interest of time, say a few things about why his metaphor of the nucleus is really important. Well, nucleus is also the word for the flaming center of a comet's head. In 1920, he wrote his first science fiction short story, which is a famous moment in science fiction studies, known as The Comet. And it's an apocalyptic short story from his mixed genre collection of work, Dark Water. Some people call it an urtext of Afro-pessimism. And the story basically discusses the relationship between a character by the name of Jim Davis and another character by the name of Julia after a comet hits New York and unleashes toxic gases that kill everyone in New York City except them. They were afraid the nucleus was going to hit New York, but only the tail of the comet did so. to the world, the world had already, I mean, the black world might have already thought of itself coming to an end, like a comet had already landed. If this story was published in 1920, we can just look back a couple years to the sort of pessimism that would have permeated black social life. There was the influenza pandemic, of course, of 1918. To give one incredible fact here, the white death rate from the influenza pandemic in 1918 for 1 year, at the height of the pandemic, was the same as the annual black death rate between 1906 and 1920. And then in 1919, you had the Red Summer of 1919. And so, but furthermore, the idea of a comet, the idea of a life-ending comet was actually popular at the time. It was this notion, certainly Du Bois's readers would have been familiar with the notion that a comet could strike down the Earth and destroy it. In 1919, for example, when the comet Morehouse passed by, astronomers announced that they had found a particular new toxic gas in its tail, a discovery that might have gone largely unremarked upon by the general public, except for the fact that another comet, which we probably remember, would be passing near Earth 2 years later, Halley's Comet. In little more time, there was widespread panic. Okay, so briefly, one way of thinking about this story is that it argues that the world has to come to an end itself for racism to be abolished. As Saidiya Hartman says of the story, white supremacy is so eternal that its only certain defeat would be the death of man. So that's why people consider this the urtext of Afro-pessimism. You could read this, however, in a different angle. I read it as an allegory for a leadership practice that Du Bois, a leadership practice or philosophy that Du Bois would practice in the world of cooperative life, in his activism around cooperatives. So you could think in the image of the comet that the tail itself is the social base. And the leaders, as he says about W.C. Matney, are the nucleus or the head of the comet, right? So the leaders, in this sense, should help to start a movement and just as quickly abscond from view. So this already, for me, gives me a radically different impression or understanding of Du Bois, especially around his talented 10th philosophy, which, we all remark on how it hobbled him as he engaged his other radical ventures. So the leaders, the nucleus should disappear into the tail of blackness or the social base, as what happens in the story, which in itself is as boundless as outer space. So instead of the leaders carrying out a predetermined program for an inferior general public, Du Bois envisions them as working with the people by way of surprise. And so we have this idea that then a social movement for Du Bois is not simply, as we would tend to consider him, an organized and predetermined effort, but a spontaneous one. And this is actually some of the frustration that people had with his approach to this movement. So in the matters of persistence and social movements, how is this a way out? In a sense, one could say that instead of this story, or instead of a movement itself, like a revolution, bringing the world to a kind of end, here we have a vision, and in Du Bois' activism, we can see it pan out, that if it's always the beginning, there's never the fall. And so it helps us just recalibrate the way we can approach or assess the success of a movement, and also define its radical, or redefine its radical insurgency. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn. Can I do it from, because I have, can everybody hear me okay? I'm pretty good at projecting, and I think the auditorium has pretty good sound. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Culver, Dr. Barnes, for organizing. Thank you to the students for participating in organizing and for having us here. And I thought a lot about what I was going to say today. And I really appreciate both, Ankit and Irvin's talks, because they were very sort of tight and based in their own research. And my talk today is going to sort of diverge from that, because I'm not primarily an expert on Du Bois. I am a scholar of immigration, a scholar of borders, but I do take race seriously, and I don't think that you can take race seriously and not come in the tradition of Du Bois. At the same time, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but at the same time, I find it very, very difficult to separate or to talk about our intellectual commitments without addressing what's happening right now. And particularly as we sit in a conference co-organized by students, as we sit in a place, Brown, that has seen encampments recently, as we sit in a world witnessing a genocide. And so today I'm going to talk about borders, I'm going to talk about Du Bois, I'm going to talk about Palestine, and I don't promise you that it's all going to hold together, but we're on this journey for the next 10 minutes together. I'll try to keep it as a tight 10 because I do want to hear from you all, and particularly have my co-panelists engage questions from you all. But the reason I say that I'm not an expert on Du Bois, but I don't think you can separate your work from Du Bois, is because I think there are three central premises that Du Bois gives us. And the first is the humanity of all people, right? That we are all equally human, and that nobody is less human than anybody else. He writes against the idea of intellectual inferiority. He writes against the supposition that because the outcomes look discrepant, that means that people are actually discrepant. And I think about this in our, modern, in our contemporary, approach to thinking about race, whether race is regressing, right, and finding how outcomes look like for different groups, different racial categories, or whether we really attend to race as a process. And I think that, in the Du Boisian tradition, we center race as a process, center how we get to the racial categories, what it means that we've arrived here. Du Bois centers the fact of the color line as being the most important, right? Centers our racial divisions as being the most important issue that we have to attend to. And I don't think you could study borders and migration without believing that centrally. I don't think that there's a way to understand these issues without understanding that race is central to them, and the inequality of racism particularly. And third, that we can prove this all empirically, right? That people who actually understand the inferiority of others don't have the empirics to back them up, right? But when you actually empirically delve into why people's this all sort of a question of why the world looks the way it does, right? And why the outcomes of Black and brown people are so discrepant when you compare them to the outcomes of white people. And I think this is the main outcome driving my work as well. If you go to any refugee camp in the world, they look different in different places, but the vast majority of them are full of Black and brown faces, and that's at the borders of the European Union, that's at the borders of the United States, and they come from very different kinds of backgrounds. So you'll find Afghanis, Nigerians, Somalis, increasingly Ukrainians, though this is a new case and they actually don't stay in the same refugee camp, so we could talk about that in the Q&A. All people, Palestinians, all people who are in the same camp, sort of waiting in the same conditions, having gone over the same routes. And for me, my research on borders thinks about sort of how we got here, how we got to this bordered world. And we have this understanding in sociology that borders are, or we have an understanding, actually a lay understanding, that borders are sort of sovereign markers of territory, right? That they exist there, that states have a right to protect them. And then, people who try to unpack that historically, and here I'm thinking of Chuck Tilley, who is sort of the sociologist who has thought about this, or who we take our lead from, think about it as a very long ago historical process that happens in the 1600s. That's about taxation and about war. But actually, when you think about modern borders, this is a post-colonial project. So the way that the borders look so rigid is something that starts after the end of colonialism. And the reason why it looks the way it does is because colonizers, having lost their territorial advantage, having hoarded the wealth from the colonized, are sort of protecting that wealth against the colonized. And so therefore, they have something to sort of erect borders against. And the borders just get more and more rigid, more and more technologically guarded, more and more violent as people begin to sort of migrate against them. And Tindaya Chiumi at UCLA argues that seen from this vantage, right, migration can actually be seen as a sense of decolonization because people are moving against those borders in order to try to access some resource to which they have been denied. And while I don't completely agree with her because we know how racist the countries are to which people are migrating, so I don't think people are actually getting a piece of the puzzle, I do think that the idea is interesting because it requires us to think about borders outside of the notion of sovereignty and in this idea of colonialism, right? That to think about, again, to the Du Boisian, imperative to think about how we got, what were the processes that sort of got us to these outcomes. And, the way that I think about it, and this is again to bring up the car window example that both of my colleagues brought up, is that we have to actually talk to people, right? You have to actually understand how people experience these border zones. And so, taking that seriously, I began to speak to people in border regions. I began to talk to people about their migration processes, about their experiences, about why they left home, but also about the route itself. And what I've come to argue, and what the project is called, the project's called The Cost of Borders, what I've come to see is that actually borders, rather than markers of sovereign territory, are comprised of a series of transactions. To get from place A to place B, people have to pay smugglers, they have to get loans from loan sharks, they have to sometimes pay bribes, and they're up against, and there's whole economies that are formed. So for instance, on the border between the EU and Turkey, there are brokers who hold your money until you get to your destination because the European Union is pushing people back into the Aegean Sea, and therefore, and they can't afford to pay the smuggler 10 plus times, which is the number of times people get pushed back. And so there's now a broker holding the money. There's a smuggler. There's people who know how to get to the smuggler. There's people who trust some brokers and not other brokers. There's loan sharks that are involved. There's money transfer operations. So these microeconomies get formed around the border zone. And from the perspective of states, right, we also are seeing exorbitant spending on these border apparatus. We're seeing drones. We're seeing technology that can surveil text messages and phones. We're seeing, more traditional sort of enforcement apparatuses in terms of fast boats, in terms of, the arming of border personnel. And so when you see it from this perspective, you're seeing these different costs, these discrepant costs that are forming this border zone. And so what I argue is that borders are comprised of this series of transactions that are always costly and also often deadly. And of course, that shapes people's ability to move, and it shapes people's ability to move day to day, week to week, regardless of the legal process, because the enforcement may change, but also it shapes your ability to move depending on who you are. So if you're racialized, if you're a young Arab man at a border in the European Union, you're going to have very different costs than, say, if you're a family of an Arab family versus if you're a young black man, versus if you're gay, versus if you're a woman who's afraid of sexual violence on the road. Every single woman I talk to experienced sexual violence in some capacity in their route. And so having these discrepant, attending to the actual experience of people and recognizing these discrepant costs, physical, emotional, but also economic, gives us a different understanding of what migration is. Right? And it's not just the movement of people across borders, but it's a very deliberate, very racialized, very gendered, process, and we need to attend to the intersections of inequalities in order to be able to understand it. But, and here's where I'm going to transition to Palestine, the three cases that I'm thinking of, or that I'm centering, are the United States border, so I spent time in Tijuana, the border between the EU and the rest of the world, which exists across the outside periphery of the European Union, but I was looking at it in Greece, in Lesbos, in the Aegean Islands, and the border of Gaza with Israel. And this last border has, of course, grabbed my attention extensively lately, right? So I've written about it. It's been a central issue, and it's partly because if you go on GoFundMe right now on your phone, you will find thousands of campaigns from people in Gaza trying to get out, and there are discrepant costs. They're fundraising for essentially what amounts to a bribe, what amounts to a fee that's paid to Egyptian authorities in order to be able to exit Gaza. And that used to be, $10,000 to $15,000 per person. Now it's around $5,000 to $10,000, depending on how fast that you want to go. But this means that if you have a family of four, which is a small family, that's upwards of $20,000 to $30,000 that you have to get and then you have to pay attention to the transfer fees, which reduce the money. You have to have some money to buy something or eat once you get out. And so when we think about it from this perspective, we see this huge cost. And in preparation for this, I began to think, well, what was Du Bois' perspective on Palestine? And here we have an interesting case, because even though Du Bois in 1919, and here I have the quotes, so give me a second. So even though Du Bois in 1919, with the Egyptian Revolution and the overthrow of Saad Zaghloul by Egyptians against the British, and these are Arabs, right? He writes, "We are all one, we the despised and oppressed, the N-words of England and America. Our hearts pray that right may triumph and justice and pity over brute force of the organized theft and race prejudice from San Francisco to Calcutta and from Cairo to New York," right? Even though he had penned those words in 1919, he does not think the same way about Palestine. And there's an excellent article that I suggest you all look up if you're interested in this by Nadia Al-Ahmed in Critical Sociology, entitled From Black Zionism to Black Nasserism, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Foundations of Black Anti-Zionist Discourse. And Du Bois, like his contemporaries, so this was also the position held by the Communist Party at the time, this was a position held by multiple black intellectuals, saw links between black and Jewish history. And in his 1948 article, The Ethics of the Problem of Palestine, he focused on oppression and dispossession and outlined the similarities between anti-Semitism and anti-blackness. And he bought into the Zionist idea that you needed a space for people to go, right? That because of this experience of anti-Semitism, because of the Holocaust, because of, but he linked it sort of millennia of oppression, that people needed a place to go. And so he believed in the idea of Zionism as a conclusion to it. And, but what was interesting is that in his belief, in his argument, in his pro-Zionist argument, he also espouses a lot of the racist tropes that we read about Arabs elsewhere, where the Orientalists that are contemporary. So he writes, and this is surprising, right? Palestine is a land largely of plateaus, mountains, and deserts, sparsely inhabited, and could easily maintain millions more people than the 2 million it has today. Among the Arabs, there is widespread ignorance, poverty, and disease, and a fanatic belief in the Mohammedan religion, which makes these people suspicious of other peoples and other religions. Their rulership is a family and clan despotism, which makes effective use of democratic methods difficult, right? And you actually hear a lot of people espousing the same kinds of racist claims against Arabs and against Palestinians today. And to understand this, though, to understand why Du Bois, who was so committed to the humanity of people, had this view, you have to understand what's happening contemporaneously. So yes, there's hints of Western imperialism. Yes, that's a very racist sort of paragraph. Also, you have to think about the Nation of Islam's rise. He's writing against the Nation of Islam. He does not see he sees himself as antithetical to it. But at the same time, also, we're seeing the results of the Holocaust. And for him, he had gone back and forth to Europe, and I want to, push you over to my colleague JT, who has written extensively about this period. And again, I'm not an expert on it, so I actually ran this by him before I came up here today. He writes, I have seen something of a human upheaval in this world. The scream and shots of a race riot in Atlanta, the marching of the Ku Klux Klan, and the threat of courts and police, the neglect and destruction of human habitation, but nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw in 1949. And that fact, right, the fact of the Holocaust, the horror of it, really left an indelible mark on him. And so you can understand why, from that perspective, right, coupled with the anti-Muslim sentiment, coupled with, the notions of Western imperialism, the idea that these people were foreign to him, that he had espoused this sort of Zionist ideal. But Du Bois, as, and this is why I think we're here having a conference about him this many years later, right? This is why all of our work is sort of interested or finds root in his work, which is that he lived sort of multiple lives, and he was always willing to be open to the intellectual challenge, right? So his ideas are not consistent over time, and we see that 4 years after that statement, 4 years after this speech that was entitled, I can't remember what I think it's called The Negro Experience in the Warsaw Ghetto, where that's from. 4 years later is the Suez Crisis. And the Suez Crisis is where where Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is Egyptian, nationalizes the Suez Canal, which is a major vein of trade, right? You might remember maybe a year or two ago when the Suez Canal had a boat sink and the whole world went apeshit, right? So he nationalizes the Suez Canal. He's attacked by Israel, France, and England. And at that time, and Nasser also espoused a lot of Pan-African thought. He espoused, he funded and supported, other African nations in their fights against imperialism, in their fights against colonialism. And so based on that, based on him, based on some conferences that led up to the Suez Crisis, you really see a lot of that sort of pushing of intellectual thought and the casting of Israel as a colonizing entity. And that's also true, and here Du Bois actually precedes a lot of the other black intellectuals and other communist intellectuals that are of his same generation, and he writes a poem called Suez in 1956, and I'm just gonna read some excerpts here. Young Israel raised a mighty cry, shall Pharaoh write anew? But Nasser grimly pointed west, they mixed the switch's brew. Old Britain would be great again with war on earth, the bad will to men, and France would civilize the dead and make the black Sahara red. Israel, as the West betrays it, murdered, mocked, and damned, becomes the shock troop of two knaves who steals the dark man's land. Beware, white world, that a great black hand Nasser's power waves, grasps hard the concentrated hate of myriad million slaves. So you could see that he's made this transition in 1956. And I think that what's interesting to me, and to bring it back to our sort of contemporary moment, is I think a lot of folks, it's because of this social movement, it's because of Nasser, but it's also because of a lot of the sort of social movement that exists, around and below Nasser across the African continent, that he makes this transformation. And I think it's really interesting as we watch these encampments rise around the country, as we watch people really become radicalized by this moment, as we all watch, a genocide together happening with our tax dollars, that a lot of people are making a similar sort of, are shifting their understanding, right? And are understanding, the Israeli state as a colonizing entity, despite, continuing to consider the horrors of the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism that does exist and that is the case. And so it's a very interesting transition that he makes, and it makes me think about, how much sort of freedom, how much that intellectual transformation is so interesting and is so, it speaks to him as a person, and how little we allow that of people today, right? That sort of shift in intellectual, that challenging of our priors, etc. And just to bring it back, and I have these 2 minutes left, so just to bring it back to the case of borders and why we should attend to Palestine and why this particular note in the story is important, is because, Palestine is truly ground zero of a lot of the carceral and border tech that we talk about globally, right? And so, the surveillance technology, the drone technology, the artificial intelligence technology that's created under the conditions of an occupation are truly groundbreaking in the worst way possible. And that's because, they're created with impunity, right? They're created without having a pushback or a resistance or a possibility because Israel is not accountable to the Palestinians. And so it's really telling that when, that a Newsweek article, the headlines, and it wasn't just in Newsweek, it was across platforms, was very concerned that, the iron wall, which keeps Gazans in, which has kept Gazans in for the last 17 years, was breached by Hamas, which is a low-tech foe, because it is the same technology that animates our U.S. wall, the wall at our southern border, because it is the same technology that Frontex uses in the waters there. And so when we're talking about Palestine, when we're talking about, what it means to push for a free Palestine, to resist occupation, to resist apartheid, it's not just about the horrors of this current genocide, but it's also about sort of what those conditions allow to be created and how they're used on us in the rest of the world. So, one way to think about it is that Palestine is more than a node in a system of global apartheid. It's actually a ground zero for a lot of the technology that keeps us all sort of, the oppressed, as Du Bois put it in 1919. So thank you for your time.
Wow. That's all I have. Questions? Wait, first, actually, can we give them another round of applause? That was all three of you. Thank you so much for your words. Questions?
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Yeah, I feel like I just learned so much. I think my question may be more toward the first two speakers, but Heba, I think you could probably riff on this a little bit too, depending on how we interpret the South. I wanted to see for the first two of you, if you all could talk a little bit more about the centrality of place and specifically the South to how Du Bois thinks about environment, how Du Bois thinks about cooperatives, and then Heba, maybe this is also an opportunity to think about the South in a global context and the centrality of place to kind of Du Bois's thinking about the color line more specifically.
Oh, okay. So, for what's interesting to me about the way he's imagining the cooperative movement and these cooperatives being founded in the South is just how much devastation to these projects he is encountering. And so, just to join your presentation, I mean, in Quest of the Silver Fleece, the cooperatives that he's imagining beginning are in a swamp. And it's hard to think of this without thinking of the Great Dismal Swamp, where blacks literally took up residence in order to disappear, as if they lived in trees. And eventually so I guess the sum of what I'm trying to say is that cooperatives, by being plotted in the South, was also an encounter with grief, right? So just to think about a social movement in terms of the processing of grief and what it means to persist on ruins and to flourish there. And I think that is one of the provocations I have for how I understand it going in the South rather than coming up where the world is supposed to be brighter suns in the North.
Wonderful question. I'm so excited for your book on this. But just to offer two things. So I think what you were saying is absolutely right. Is that for Du Bois, the South ecologically offered refuge. In Black Reconstruction, he writes about St. Catherine's Island and the cooperative there as sort of sheltering a movement of land stewardship. But more critically, for him, the South is not just a geographical place, but it's an idea of how to organize place. And he uncovers this amazing kind of text of planters who are organizing and wanting to extend the South, not just from the existing American South, but all the way to the Caribbean, all the way to the West, and even see it as a worldwide global project all the way to Brazil, et cetera. So the South is an idea of how to organize land. And he talks about the role of black labor in creating, firstly, this plantation system, because it was absolutely, parts of it were swamp, and the land had to be modified to be adaptable to cotton plantations. But that led to its ruin, right? And so when he travels, travels to the Black Belt in Georgia and the souls of black folk, he talks a lot about the dilapidated mansions, the worn out soil. He has, I have a section of the paper that talks about all these kind of, he kind of personifies soil as coy and grim and worn out. And he thinks about how that animates the both how people interact in that space and their experience in it. And I think that's where I've been really thinking through how place and the experience of place comes to shape racism, and I'm really excited for your project on that.
I'm okay. I'm gonna let you, because I feel like I've spoken a lot already.
Hi, thank you again for being here. I really appreciate all the work you guys are doing and for speaking to us. My name is Jacqueline, and my question was originally for Ankit, but if any of you want to speak on it as well. So Ankit, your article illuminating in part Du Bois's engagement with environmental themes in relation to race, labor, and class has been a pivotal source for my own work. So I was very excited to see you on the program. So my question is, what do you see on the horizon by making this argument? What are some compelling or perhaps contradictory theoretical or methodological possibilities to a Du Bois environmental framework or environmental racism framework? And I say this environmental racism framework, a Du Boisian one, not to compartmentalize Du Bois or Du Boisian sociology, but in an attempt to integrate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel, my heart's fluttering because thank you so much for that really kind words about my work. I'm really excited for all the different ways that people are going to take, and not to kind of box Du Bois in that if you read my work, I'm trying to open up avenues for scholars of different sociological tracks of either borders or racism or phenomenology to kind of think about the environment and all those different questions. And I too have been asked, I've been kind of, giving guest lectures on this paper this year, and I too have been asked, like, where are the contemporary conditions that exhibit some of the things that you're talking about, the way in which land is being modified to reinforce racial projects? I too have also been thinking of Gaza and sort of the long history of constructing that land as empty and as Arab Palestinians as unfit stewards of that land, and the ways in which both the construction of the land by the Israeli state reinforces racialization of the people that exist there. But I can also offer, on my own research and thinking, that when it comes to climate change is offering radical changes in environmental distributions. Places that are breadbaskets are no longer going to be breadbaskets. And if we are to take Du Bois's theory seriously, these novel unequal distributions of land will likely lead to reconfigurations of racial categories. So we see that in the case of India today, where in the north of India, which is the Gangetic Belt, is seeing rapid heat waves, rapid reduction of water, not just for climate change, but for other reasons. And that's leading to a mass migration of Indians from the north to the south, where there's increasing conflict over land and jobs in the south, which is heightening racism between southern Indians and northern Indians. And I think there, Du Bois, while most of his theories are located in the American South, he saw the South as a global project. And so, he can give us methodological tools to unpack how all these different new ecological changes are leading to new forms of racialization. That's, very ripe for lots of dissertations, but also ripe for really horrific, political outcomes that might emerge in the coming decades.
Hello. My question is for Heba. I hope I said your name correctly. My name is Temi Alau. I'm a PhD student at Emory Sociology. I'm also a race and immigration scholar with a Du Boisian orientation. Should I start that? In any case, I really appreciate your perspective on borders as constructs that are increasingly becoming colonial projects through their violent weaponizations and technological advances. But my question, I know you said you're not an expert on Du Bois, but I'm just curious about what you think about this. Du Bois has been critiqued for being less critical on colonial projects and colonialism and race outside of U.S. borders. And I think that your talk is a good example of this. You talked about his writing on Jewish migrations to Palestine or the colonial occupation of Palestine and of the Palestinian people using a very Zionist lens, right? And yet, in an essay a few years later in the Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto, which you mentioned as well, he highlighted the colorblind ideologies that were very prevalent, persistent across Central and Eastern Europe, specifically Germany and Poland, in ways that suppressed and erased issues of race and ethnicity. But I'm wondering why he couldn't have, or he didn't have this same critical lens of coloniality, racism, whenever talking about the people of Palestine and Jewish migrations, quote unquote, to Palestine. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for it, and and thank you for asking it. I think so. I want to say two different things. I do think that he, as a thinker, had a lot of different, JT called it sort of chapters in his life, and I do think that he really allowed. Before this, as I said, I ran things by JT to make sure I wasn't saying things that were completely incorrect, because I put this chronology together over the last couple of days. And JT mentioned that when he visited Europe and prior to that he was supportive of World War I. When he visited Europe, he was kind of enamored with the imperial project, and then he recognizes sort of over time that the problems of it. And I think he does write actually pretty eloquently about colonialism and against colonialism, and I think he does understand that to an extent. But I also think nobody is infallible, right? And so I do think that obviously there are holes here, and there are issues that he could have addressed more directly. But I think that what's more interesting for me is to salvage the ideas that he offered us, which is sort of how I started the talk, which is that today, and I think that the mainstream continues, even mainstream sociology continues to be guilty of this. We treat outcomes as though they're inevitable. So even as we're talking about borders, one of the main things that I butt up against is that, well, this is how things are, right? We treat outcomes that continuously leave, Black and brown people in inferior positions, discrepant positions, less resource positions, unequal positions to white people. We treat that as sort of an inevitability, that this is just what it looks like, and we neglect to recognize the process that gets us there. And I think that's the real beauty of Du Bois, is that he always, from we're talking 100 and some years later, right? He attended to the idea that we have to pay attention to process. And so I don't think he always got it right. I don't think anybody always gets it right. But I do think that he's offered us tools to ask the right questions of the things that we're observing. And so again, I'm not, my scholarship does not center any one thinker or any one theorist. But I think that if we are to think about, as critical race theorists or as people who take a critical approach, where that sort of, history comes from, I would say that in America, and I think there are people, globally who do this in different ways, I think Du Bois has to be a central sort of character there because of his attention, because of the questions that he asked of process. So is he perfect? No. Can we salvage that bit? I think yes. Reasonable people may disagree, but I am not against holding a conference in his name because I think that is the real sort of beauty and interest, is the empirical inquiry into these, status quo, normally accepted outcomes. I don't know if my colleagues have thoughts.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the things that I love about the category of chance for him is just how much that foregrounds the vulnerability to the machinery of white supremacy and undermines like the determinism we talked about in sociology hesitant yesterday. And so, that there's just like that inevitable possibility. And just to go back to this idea of going back to the South, it is interesting how that refigures the way he's thinking of progress. And in terms, I've always thought of that move, especially during the Harlem Renaissance, and the optimism of the Harlem Renaissance of moving into the future, charted by way of this migration up north. I've always thought of that move as like finding a future in the past, and so you have like, instead of like this past future, but you have a future past, and just thinking of how he's harnessing that category of time next to chance, and
Yeah, if I can add on that, what's amazing, what I love about Black Reconstruction is that just hovering below the text is all these counterfactuals, right? The fact that it could have gone differently. And I always teach that book in a way to remind students that this is not inevitable, right? There are choices that were contingently made in specific situations, and paying attention to that process, that chance, the ways in which counterfactuals of abolition democracy emerge and could have been successful and were successful for a short period of time. And provide us a chart for our own futures, I think is something that animates his own selection of his own cases, right? He chooses these moments of crises where things can go slightly differently as a way to think about process in that way, and I think that's a great insight for sociological work in general. Yeah.
I feel like we can keep going forever. I love this so much. Thank you guys so much for coming. All three of you were invited to be in this session because of the angle at which you think about Du Bois and his connection to land, whether that's through borders or environmental justice or cooperatives, and really thinking about these as different seeds, different avenues that could in some ways be put together to form a Du Boisian ecologies, right? And so I just want to thank you guys for this conversation, for your sort of connections with each other, and let's give them one big ol' round of applause.